I'm delighted to introduce our next speaker, Florence Smith-Nichols from Queen Mary University of London. I work with Florence. Florence is a PhD student, and we work together on a number of research projects that you're going to talk about now. I shouldn't repeat people's introductory slides. I think you've lost...
Yeah, classic, it's the archaeologist that has the technical problems. So now I'm going to talk to you about archaeology, and specifically how to archaeologically record a video game. And if you don't know me, I'm Florence. I'm a fourth-year PhD student. I'm actually in my final year of my PhD, which is a little bit scary, on the IGGI program at Queen Mary University of London. But actually, prior to that, I had a very different life. I worked as an archaeologist for about 7 years, including as a field archaeologist here in London and as a heritage consultant. And it was really that was kind of like some of the kind of background that got me into looking at archaeological approaches to video games. But I've also worked as a games writer and a narrative designer. So I worked as a story tech at the indie studio Die Gute Fabrik. So I've done some kind of freelance work in that area. And also this month I wrote my first LARP about a funeral for an AI god. So that was fun. I thought I'd just put that in for you. And here's a couple of pictures to kind of illustrate those points. That's me doing some field work in the Cyclades. I always like to put this in to kind of prove, that I wasn't always working behind a computer. It's in a very beautiful place. And that's Sotzi Chronicles on the right, which is the narrative game I worked on at Die Gute Fabrik. And then in the bottom there, you can see an exhibition at the British Library that I did some curatorial work for. I did some of the kind of gameplay footage for it, and it was about digital storytelling. And that also kind of formed an archive that the British Library has now got as well. So these are kind of all the different projects that I've been doing, as well as my PhD research. So in this talk, I'm going to, first of all, kind of explain a little bit what is, archaeogaming or archaeological approaches to video games, and then look at 3 different case studies from my PhD research, which kind of focus on 3 very different games and the different approaches I took to archaeologically recording them. So first of all, archaeogaming, what on earth is that, if you don't know? So on a very basic level, it's archaeology and games. And if you're thinking of archaeology and video games, what might first come to mind is Lara Croft, for example, is probably the most famous video game archaeologist. And in the past, I would say that she's not a very good example of an archaeologist. But I've actually changed my mind on this when I was writing this talk. I was really thinking about it. And the thing is that archaeology does have this, very colonial past of people going and essentially looting stuff. And, the clue is in the name. Tomb Raider, right, is the name of the series. And actually, it's kind of good to reflect on this. And in some ways, sadly, maybe she is kind of representative of the field, or at least its past. I think now archaeology wants to be better. But yeah, to kind of reflect on what game archaeology is, you can kind of see it as being these sort of 3 kind of overlapping areas. So first of all, there's representation. So how is the past represented in games? And if you think about a video game that very much is interested in this, or one that would come to mind in conversations about this, it's often Assassin's Creed, right? So that's why I put that there. And certainly there's a lot of work on how the past is represented and the ethics of that as well. And then another kind of approach is to do code archaeology, to kind of actually go into the code of a game and figure out how it was developed. There's a really good example of this by Aycock and Bittner from a 2019 article that they wrote about the 1980 game Mystery House, when they kind of go into the code and figure out how it was made, basically. And then the final area is field work, so actually applying archaeological methods to video game environments, and that's kind of what I'm going to talk about a bit more now. In the first case study, which is Elden Ring, a little game that you might have heard of. But first, I'm actually going to talk about something quite different. What I want to do with all of these case studies is kind of provide a parallel example that will hopefully kind of bring out sort of the qualities of what the work I was doing, how it kind of worked, basically. And the reason why I want to mention this specific project, which is basically an archaeological project on the International Space Station, is because often when we think about archaeology, people think it's about the past, right? I mean, that makes sense. People think it's about studying really old things, but it doesn't have to be. You can do archaeologies of the contemporary world, and this is what's happened on the ISS. And essentially in this project, what they wanted to do is kind of understand how astronauts sort of use different areas of the space station. So they kind of like created these like kind of in a way arbitrary squares that they got the astronauts to take pictures of once a day for about 60 days, I think it was, and kind of like then saw over time, how did the material culture in that area change? How did they actually use it? And it was really interesting because what they found was that, maybe not surprisingly, the astronauts didn't use those areas as they were supposed to over time. You know, they had to adapt. And the reason why I think this is relevant to doing archaeology in video games is that this project was very much about adapting kind of methodologies that you wouldn't normally use in a different kind of space, especially where, like, for example, gravity doesn't exist in the same way, right? And in a video game, actually, physics don't always work the same. The world isn't always the same. So now on to Elden Ring. And in much the same way that in the space archaeology project, they wanted to sample specific areas. In this archaeological survey that we did of Elden Ring, we wanted to sample certain areas of the game. And yeah, if you don't know Elden Ring, you probably do. It's an action role-playing game made by From Software, who are notorious for making very difficult games. But this was the first game in the kind of Soulsborne series that is an open world game, and you can see there's this huge map, and we only looked at like 2 locations, the Stormfoot Catacombs and the Church of Ella, which is just like a grain of sand in kind of this whole map. But essentially the point of the survey was to look at player messages and bloodstains. So something that Elden Ring has is that if you're in the online mode, you can see messages that players are left in the landscape, and also bloodstains, which you can touch, and then you can see the last few seconds of gameplay before they died. So this is interesting because players are essentially leaving traces, both deliberately or not, in the landscape of their kind of activity. So the idea was to see what can we learn about players and how they interact with these particular areas by kind of recording the location of these messages and bloodstains in relation to other things in the environment. And we did this, by adapting kind of traditional archaeological methods, one of which is drawing a plan. So kind of, you can see kind of in the bottom left here, we've got a plan to scale of the Church of Ella, and then the locations of different messages and bloodstains. And this was quite difficult because, video game like Elden Ring, you don't have like a tape measure like you do in real life. So actually the unit of measure that we used to draw this to scale was the player character's foot. So that was quite interesting and a very laborious process. But actually, reflecting on it, it was kind of really interesting to kind of get a more kind of fine-grained understanding of that space and how it felt to kind of move around it. We found lots of interesting things through doing this survey, one of which is that, there were these kind of like memes that kept on coming up. So for example, here you can see there's a message that says, could this be a love? And that's kind of, if you look at kind of like online conversations around Elden Ring, you realize this is a way of referring to a fan favorite character who can appear here at a certain time. So you kind of, in order to fully understand what's going on in this game, you have to also kind of look at online sources as well. And the second location was very different. We wanted to look at something where it's sort of like this long corridor that leads to then this room where there's sort of like a fire trap, but also there's this imp up on like the corner just as you turn around that will normally kind of jump scare you basically and potentially kill you. And what was interesting here is that we found a lot of messages that were actually helpful to players, like this one where it says, be wary of up. There's only certain like combinations of words you can use in a message. So people are actually trying to help each other, which I found really nice for a game that has this sort of reputation, right, for being very hard and like, this idea of like, oh, you got to get good or whatever. But it's like, actually, no, there's some players, they want to help each other. And they're not just, telling them to go and like find illusory walls or something that don't exist. So I've got a QR code which will link to the 2022 article that we wrote up about this. We're also going to do a follow-up survey because the DLC, of course, came out this year, and so we wanted to kind of like see how maybe player activity changed around that time. And I just wanted to include this screenshot from that. We haven't published the results of this yet, but something that was kind of funny about this is when we went back to the Church of Ella, we realized that players had basically done parkour on the ruins of this church to put messages in really like difficult to find places. You can kind of just about see it on the screen there. Oh, sorry. So basically, in order to do the survey, we also had to do parkour in order to try and reach these messages and see what they said. I was terrible at it, so I couldn't actually get to all of them. But that was a very interesting experience doing an archaeological survey in Elden Ring. And the second case study is a game called Worm Online. But first, again, I want to kind of give sort of like a parallel example which is relevant. So back in 2019, I did this little zine about Rayman 2 and how much I love it, because when I was a kid, I played it with my best friend on Nintendo 64, and it's kind of like this really strong memory for me, because for some reason she didn't have a memory card for her Nintendo 64, which meant that we were basically playing it as a roguelike. Like every time we played, we couldn't save it. It's just, I can never forget this experience, and now Rayman 2 is one of my favorite games. And I talk about this because I think probably a lot of us here have very strong memories of playing a game at a particular time. And if we're thinking about games preservation, often there are discussions about having access to hardware or software, but actually capturing the experience of playing a game, especially at a particular time, is really difficult. These things are very ephemeral and fleeting, and I think that's a really important part of games preservation as well. And so that leads me on to Worm Online, which is a game that was originally released in 2006. It's an MMO. Actually, who here has played Worm Online? I'm very curious. Okay, there's a couple of people. That's good. So this is interesting because it's an example of a game. We had, Elden Ring, AAA game. Probably most people here have heard of it. This is a game where maybe some people here have played of it. It's quite an obscure MMO. But it still exists. You can still play it now, and there's a core group of players that still play it to this day. And it still looks like this. It's kind of got this charming aesthetic. But the reason why we became interested in it is that with Worm, for example, it has the independent server. One of the servers has been running since 2010, and it has loads of player-created structures in it. So for a video game, especially an MMO, that's a really long time, right? 14 years. These things still exist. There's actual, there's heritage here. And we went into the game and discovered this big tunnel called the Dragonfang Pass, which is actually designated as a heritage site by the game's community. So immediately I was really interested as an archaeologist, thinking, okay, this community has this sense of a heritage site. I want to know more about this. And also with Worm, the way it works is that kind of structures can only persist if they're continually repaired and maintained. So it's very intentional. And also, another thing to say about Worm is that doing anything basically in it is really difficult and time-consuming. So to create this tunnel, which, by the way, takes about 10 real-world minutes to walk through, would probably take thousands and thousands of hours. Someone's it's a lot of real human labor, right? It's interesting to kind of look into, okay, why did people make this? What are the kind of memories that people have around this? How do they consider it to be a part of their heritage? And the way that we decided to do this was to use a methodology called the go-along methodology. And this hasn't actually really explicitly been used in games really much at all, as far as we could tell. And it kind of is what it sounds like. Basically, you go along with someone on a walk in a place that they know. Usually it'd be an everyday walk that they do. And the idea is kind of a combination between an interview and participant observation. And kind of the participant is guiding you on where to go, and you might be asking questions that are kind of prompted by the environment. So this kind of seemed well suited, right, to this game where we could actually go in and do a walk with people because it's an MMO, right, and actually kind of explore their memories of a particular place. So this is what we did. We mapped out the different routes that we took, as you can see in this map here. This is one of the routes that we took through the mountain and also in the surrounding area. And we just had these really incredible conversations with people, which I don't have time to go into, but one I really want to highlight is we met with a curator of an in-game museum who had obviously incredible stories and knowledge of the game. And they took us around their museum. One of the things they showed us was a memorial to players who had passed on. And there are these candles here which had been left by the players. And they also talked about how they see the game as being a sacred space, specifically because it's something that has all these people in it constantly maintaining it, which was just a really fascinating conversation. And we found that if we hadn't done this kind of go-along methodology, maybe these memories wouldn't have come up because it just kind of naturally happened through the process. And again, I've got the QR code, but I'll be repeating this at the end if you're interested in reading like the full piece about it. I also got this bit from the transcript. This is where basically I couldn't figure out how to use a ladder in the game, which was really embarrassing. So it was just kind of interesting to sort of reflect on being a researcher in this space who wasn't an expert, especially on how to play the game, and like actually the participant kind of like taking the lead and kind of like reflecting on the sort of researcher-participant dynamics then. And now, the final example, case study, is Nothing Beside Remains. But first, let's talk about environmental storytelling. And I'm glad that Tommy like kind of made us reflect on this room, because I'm going to do that now as well. You talked about it like where the stage is, but now I want to kind of, if you look around you, you can see like there's lots of material culture, right, that people have brought with them. Maybe you have like a bag. I can see my own bag. And my point about this is you can do an archaeology of this room. Like you can learn about the people in this room or the event that's going on, right, from how, you know, the plates are laid out and things like this. And I would argue that environmental storytelling basically in games invites players to be archaeologists, because you have to interpret the material culture in the game. And this is a big theme in this case study. So Nothing Beside Remains is a very short abstract game, as you can see in the GIF on the screen, where basically you explore this procedurally generated ruined village. Mike Cook actually was the original developer of this, but we worked on it together for the project. And the way it works is that there are several different kind of factors that can lead to the ruination of this village. There's kind of like several layers of simulation. And also with the in-game text, there's this grammar replacement, so different words can kind of be recombined as well. But I was really interested in doing a study on this game because essentially it does invite you to try and understand what happened to this place based on the material culture that's left behind. And so we decided to do a player study. It was an online study where we had, let's say, almost 200 respondents. We gave them very open-ended questions, where it's things like, what do you think happened to this village? But also pick out an object, and why did you find this object interesting? Why do you think it was left there? And as part of this kind of study, we deliberately put in something that we called a bait item, which was a pocket watch. And the reason for putting this in is because a pocket watch, it seemed very incongruous with the rest of the material culture in this village, especially technologically. So we wanted to see if people would pick up on that and kind of think, oh, this doesn't really match. So I was kind of like testing how will people react to this. And the answer is yes. A lot of people did react to it, and immediately, as we kind of like hoped, kind of noticed, like you can see in these examples here, we're saying, oh, this is inconsistent, and oh, other objects, you know, had simple objects like bowls, but that doesn't really work. And this is really interesting because basically players are like implicitly using kind of like archaeological methodology of like comparing like material culture and context, and we kind of have evidence of this. And yeah, you can see this kind of GIF on the screen. As part of the study, we also mapped the players' routes through the game. So it's really interesting to see how like spatially people like approach the game world as well. And there will be a follow-up study where we kind of look at this. And again, I've got kind of the link to the study, which I'll put at the end. And there's going to be kind of, more publications relating to this that will go into more depth on the results that we found. And just to sum up, really, so I've been talking about all these different case studies, and in archaeology, there's this concept of preservation by record, so the idea that you can preserve things by making a record of it, and traditionally that might be through photography or plans or something like that, and kind of this is also what I've been sort of applying to games in different ways, and as you can see with these three examples, they all have different affordances, different qualities, which means that certain methodologies work better for them. So my argument is really that with different games, you can't have a one-size-fits-all way of preserving games, which is why, for example, recording like player messages might work for Elden Ring, but with Worm Online, it makes sense to actually go into the environment itself. And Nothing Beside Remains, because we worked on it ourselves, that meant that we could like actually change things and iterate on the game design. And then that tied into the player study as well. So that is the end, and then you have all 3 QR codes if you want them, and those are my details. So if you want to get in contact, please do ask me any questions. Thanks so much.
This one, yeah, this is still working. This is great. Thank you so much, Florence. We've got some time for questions if there are any. Yeah?
You sure? Oh, thank you. Hi. First, praise the dog. My question was, is RKO Gaming concerned about the potential permanent loss of some intellectual property in video games, whether due to the game being very old and no longer in production, or because the intellectual property owner consistently deletes any records of them from online, and how is the legality of that?
I'd say yes, more and more. I feel like maybe in the past this wasn't so much part of the conversation, but I think, yeah, as in general with like conversations around games preservation, this is a huge concern. And it is tricky, like you say, because, for example, I've been on a project, for example, at the British Library where we were looking at an app that was only released in like 2017, but it's already not on the App Store. You can't get it anymore, right? And that's just one example. And these things are so easily lost. And luckily, we got in contact with the developer, and they did have some of the materials. But in a lot of cases, yeah, devs may not have, like, say, for example, documentation about their work process, which could be really useful. And maybe they're not aware that, like, archivists, archaeologists, all these people would be really interested in it. So I think it's something where there's so much potential for, like, collaboration, basically. Yeah, hope that answers.
Thank you.
I think I might have time for one more.
Thanks for a fantastic talk. I'm really interested in how people kind of record and discuss their experiences with games, and have thought about it more in relation to sort of ethnography or oral history or life writing, but archaeology is a really suggestive framework for that. My question, though, was about the sort of graffiti in Elden Ring, those hard-to-reach spots that people had kind of tagged.
Mm.
And I was curious as to what kinds of messages they were and how they may be relating to other players and or to the developers, and also whether there are parallels with the sorts of graffiti you might find at a physical archaeological site.
That's a really good question. So I'm trying to remember what we actually found. In some cases, I couldn't get to them, which was so frustrating because it was like I was impeded from recording them by my own kind of like skill. I think, again, they were probably like silly memes, which actually I think there are parallels of real-world archaeological sites. Like you think of something like Pompeii, where there's like people just writing like very silly things like on the side of buildings and stuff. So I think there's definitely potential actually to look at the parallels between how graffiti has been recorded in archaeology and, say, looking at like messages in Elden Ring. Yeah.
We think that some of them required like glitches to access, right? Like they were really, really hard to find.
Mm.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Florence. I think we're going to break now because there's a coffee break, but I just wanted to mention one piece of work. Actually, when Florence was at the British Library, they co-authored a report on the stuff that they did. So if you're interested in the preservation stuff, also look that up as well. That's available online, right? For public?
Yes, yeah.
Great. Okay, let's thank our speaker.
Thank you.